Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. And by the way, we've done 86 shows. Quite an achievement when you think of how few resources are allocated and assigned to the whole of the Indy Live process, which brings me to the absolutely essential point here. All of the success is entirely down to the huge efforts of the Indy Live team, and they need your support. If you are sitting there thinking, I like this show, or I like other shows, and I'm very upset by what the BBC says or doesn't say, this is the vehicle. You can come on here at any time. There's no license fee involved, no access considerations. You just come on and join us. And more than that, unlike the BBC, we take your questions. We don't sit there like some ivory tower and ignore you because we report to somebody in London. So if you're really upset about all of these things, I would urge you, please, to go to the crowdfunder for Indy Live and give all that you can. It's hugely important. You don't do it now, because obviously we want you to stay here and watch the show. But when the show is through, please go to the crowdfunder. I'll remind you later on, if I may. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. Keir Starmer has finally decided he has no confidence in Boris Johnson. Now, I suspect the rest of us got to that point many months ago. We also hear tonight that because of Boris Johnson's explanation, if that's the right term, perhaps I'm overstating it here, his explanation in the House of Commons today, the Scottish Tories are now revolting. Again, you may have thought that happened some time ago. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight, we'll be talking to longtime independence activist, Dr. Ian Grant, and we'll be talking about constitutions, Europe, COVID, medical matters, and we will ask Ian, who is exceptionally well versed in medical matters, if he can answer today's burning question, which is, when does a booze up become a works meeting? Lots of people.
Well,
TNT stands for Nation Talk. So in many respects, it's your show. We're live, as I said, and we're free. No license, no problem. Now, to our guest tonight, the Nation Talks to Ian Grant. Thanks for joining us, Ian. How are you? And when does a booze up? Please tell us, when does a booze up become a works party?
Well, I'm very well, thank you, John. And it's a difficult question. Once upon a time, I think in the days of when I was a junior doctor, I think booze and work did occasionally coincide. But in the last 30, 40 years, I would say that the two are very separate. And there is no way that I could describe what went on in the garden of 10 Downing Street as work. So I would say that was a booze up. And probably one of many booze ups from what we hear that have taken place in 10 Downing Street. The only thing I would say about this whole business, the sort of third-rate theatre that went on in Westminster today, is that, quite frankly, I don't care if Boris Johnson stays or goes. You can, from the Scottish nationalist point of view, you can see an advantage in him staying. But equally, I really don't care if he goes. At the end of the day, it was fairly pathetic theatre. And I think that, we've just got to get out of there. And, I don't think it really matters. I don't really know why Ian Blackford wasted so much energy in asking him to resign. I wasn't surprised by Boris's behaviour. I wasn't surprised by the fact that he lied repeatedly about his presence at parties or booze-ups or informal work occasions. But so I'm really slightly underwhelmed by it all. The one thing I would say about that Keir Starmer coming back today, I was really disappointed about that, because I think that Angela Rayner would have produced far more fireworks. She says it as it is, and I think that would have been much more fun.
Let's talk a little bit about Keir Starmer. Last week, he wrapped himself in the flag and pronounced that there were three important core values which will form a contract with the British people. And one of them was respect. What's your sense? Why is he says he's completely opposed to nationalism, but he's very much in favour of patriotism. Can you help us to understand what the difference is and what he's trying to achieve, do you think?
He has, as a politician, has disappointed me and probably disappointed quite a lot of people since he's come to power. I think he's probably suffered by too much tuition and from his minders, and he perhaps doesn't say what he thinks. On the other hand, this is a man that has accepted a knighthood, a really good socialist, and he has this. There is a thread in English Labour Party members, as well as the more radical left ones, but the Blairite types, who are really English nationalists or English patriots, they would say, but I think nationalists, and he's one of these. And of course, I think this is one of the great problems about being English, is that you really think it's the same as being British. And this is the great dilemma for them. They cannot stand the thought of the map of, they recognise the map of the United Kingdom equals England, and they cannot envisage the loss of 1/3 of the land mass and the characteristic shape of the British Isles on the weather map, and they think to themselves that they're going to have little England left. And so I think he can't quite handle that.
It's a very interesting situation they've got themselves in. But tell us a little about your journey, because you're a long-standing supporter of independence, going back a number of years. I won't mention the years unless you want to do so.
No. I'm one of many, I think, that joined in the 60s. Scottish nationalism was pretty dormant, as you well know, before the 60s. But I do remember being brought up in that part of Midlothian, which I think is now counted as a part of Edinburgh, but west of Edinburgh, out the Calder way. I remember the West Lothian by-election, where Billy Wolfe stood against Tam Dalyell for the first time in 1962. I was 12, I think, then. And I do remember the excitement, with the fact that the SNP got 9,000 plus votes, whereas the Tories got about 3,000. And of course, over the years, he never won the seat, Billy Wolfe, but it was quite exciting around there. And in fact, I remember the postman got me delivering copies of the SI to people round about. And I also remember going to university and joining the Nationalist Club. But then, of course, medicine took up study time, and that slightly got forgotten about. But I certainly campaigned in Glasgow when I was working as a junior registrar or SHO in Glasgow, senior house officer, and was campaigning in the two elections in 1974. I remember being very embarrassed by one of my colleagues finding me going up canvassing in the streets, I think, of Scotstoun or Partick, I think. That was the first slight embarrassment that I was doing that. But I certainly never, in all my medical career, I've never hidden my politics. And it's never caused me any, to be fair to our unionist friends, and most of the medical profession was unionist, with one exception. When I was told it might be a good idea to change my politics, I don't think anybody else over 30, 40 years quibbled by the fact that I was a Scottish nationalist. I was always slightly amused that you might be at a dinner, not that I went to many dinners in the College of Surgeons or College of Physicians in Edinburgh, and, once the drink had flowed a bit, people would sidle up to you and say, what do you think is going to happen? I'm, a closet Scottish nationalist. That was quite a common occurrence, far more common than one might suspect.
Truth that dare not speak its name. Now, as a former consultant in intensive care medicine, what's your take on COVID and the pandemic generally? Do you think the Scottish Government is pursuing the right approach, or do you think that Boris Johnson is a greater expert on this than anyone else?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think the Scottish Government, despite some people who have attacked it, including from, the nationalist persuasion, has done too badly, really. I think when you're governing in Scotland with your hands tied behind your back, when you can't control your borders, when you can't control really effectively your airports, it's very difficult to control the whole situation. When you can't, have a lockdown because you haven't got the means to borrow the money or print the money to pay for furlough, you really are in a difficult position. But within the constraints of that, I think the Scottish Government hasn't done too badly on that matter. I think communication at times has been very good. I think, again, people have attacked, certain folk, on the medical side, like Jason Leach. I personally think Jason has done a fantastic job. His communication skills are incredibly good. It must be incredibly difficult as a permanent civil servant, if you like, being tied up in the political debate over COVID. And I think it was quite interesting. I watched on Twitter a committee proceedings chaired by the chap that used to be the health minister, whose name escapes, Jeremy Hunt, and a medical person from expert from Sweden spent most of his evidence period praising Scotland and the Scottish patient safety scheme. And that was, of course, set up and carried out by Jason Leach. And, so I think they've supported the First Minister and Gregor as well, the Chief Medical Officer, Gregor Smith. And so I think really they've done not too badly. And I think, I haven't had, I've been retired 10 years from intensive care, and I haven't spoken to colleagues very much, although I met one of my ex-colleagues down in Stockbridge just last Friday shopping. And, I think the units have survived, they've done well. The esprit de corps, I think, in the units has been fantastic throughout. I read some of the stuff published by the Scottish Intensive Care Society, who audit intensive care in Scotland. And I think the intensive care units have done extremely well.
That's very interesting. And from your perspective, it's important to get that feedback, because when you watch the media, I can understand why people get confused, because so often a health issue is incredibly deeply politicized. In other words, why is Scotland doing something different to England? I watched Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, and he put it as eloquently as anyone. He said, the outlier is England, the outlier isn't the rest of us, because we're all singing from the same hymn sheet here. But he says, and he put it down to the fact that Boris Johnson cannot carry his cabinet with him in terms of implementing the advice he's getting from his health experts. And that's a clear indication that politics has somehow interfered with health. And by and large, that's probably not a good thing in principle anyway. But you're right. Politicians have to take the decisions in the end, because they have to balance up a number of factors, I imagine, and stuff like that. We've had some questions coming in, and they bear upon last week's discussion with Philippa Whitford, when she was talking about the after effects of COVID. And I would like to get your view on this. Stephen Kelly is saying, he's talking about mental health. He's related to independence and perhaps EU law, but I guess the broader point is that to what degree would you agree with Philippa that once we get beyond COVID, and hope for goodness we do at some early stage, do you, like her, foresee that there might be a considerable tail here of people who have health problems, but they're not specifically directly connected to COVID itself? They are mental health problems, they are problems of well-being, but not necessarily physical problems as such.
Yeah, I think there are problems that are not related directly to COVID, and the problems that are related directly to COVID as a critical illness. In intensive care, one of the things we learned over the years working, we used to get people fit enough to get out of intensive care. We sent them back to the ward and we didn't see them again. In recent years, last 20 years or so, intensivists have increasingly been following up patients in wards and then indeed seeing them as outpatients. And, in Edinburgh, there's been a very good record of this sort of intensive care follow-up. And there's no doubt whatsoever that patients who have been ill enough to require organ support in intensive care take a long, long time to get back to normal health, and they need support. They need physiotherapy. They need perhaps occupational therapy, dietary help, and certain medical help as well. And so I think COVID is actually possibly more complex than that, because COVID seems to not just cause respiratory failure, it causes cardiac effects and probably central nervous effects as well. So it's a multi-system illness. And so there's these issues. And I think that it will take a lot of people who've suffered from COVID, quite a long time to recover. As for the mental health side of things, I'm no psychiatrist or mental health expert, but there's certainly this whole business of lockdown and isolation and almost a fear of going into public places or crowded places. If you take it at its really most trivial side, it took me a while to get myself going back to Tannadice again. And that was not just because of the fear of the performance of my favourite football team, but it's the element of sitting in close proximity in a crowd. I've overcome that. But, things like going to crowded bars or theatres, I personally feel uneasy about that at the moment. And that's just the very trivial end of it all. I think folk who are more prone to mental health problems, yes, are going to have a problem. Yeah, I think they are.
Well, it's going to be it'll be interesting how governments handle that.
I think the pressures on the government will be, certainly the Tory government down south will be pretty unsympathetic, I suspect, because they want economic activity to ramp up ASAP. And, a number of these people will not feel inclined or not able to go back to perhaps high-intensity work, whether it's physical or mental. One of the things when I followed up cases in intensive care who had suffered from sepsis, was how few of them had actually gone back to work. And I remember one conversation, one chap said, I said, well, why have you not gone back to work? And he said, well, once you've been, almost killed by something like this, do I really want to go back and waste all my time grinding away, at work? And I could slightly sympathise with that.
Yeah, fascinating. Going back to politics for a second, Stephen Kelly is asking, do you think the Queen's Jubilee will put off more Scots than ever in terms of their affection for the Union?
Well, I think that fundamental change has occurred since 2014. In 2014, people were, there was a larger degree of sympathy for the royal family in Scotland than there is now. And it's not just Prince Andrew and so on. I think that Scotland, most people probably felt it was a sensible decision by Alex Salmond in 2014 to say, we're going to keep the monarchy and we're going to keep everything much the same, except that we're going to be sort of independent. I think now far more people would be willing, in fact, positive about ditching the monarchy, perhaps after the Queen departs or whatever. But I don't think this is an issue that's going to really affect folk to the same extent that it did even just 8 years ago. Yeah, so I wouldn't worry about that.
One of the issues that crops up from time to time, in fact, consistently, frankly, is the age of the age profile of those who are supportive of independence. Once you get to 55, the percentage of those in favour tails off quite dramatically until it's almost the exact inverse of those between 18 and 25. Two questions. One is, what do you put that down to? And two, how do you feel it ought to be addressed?
Gosh, this is difficult. Well, I'm firmly in the elderly group, and I should really know nobody who is an independent supporter. Of course, you choose your friends, of course, and, a lot of your friends are pro-independence, and a lot of us who are active, we sit in yes meetings and pro-independence groups, and most of us are the same age, at the wrong end of the age spectrum. And it's hard to believe that there's a 70% of this age group outside are against independence. I have to say, canvassing, I never was quite struck that it was quite as extreme as that. I always thought there was a majority of independent supporters amongst the young and a majority of unionists in the old, but it does seem, according to the opinion polls, and I have some doubts about some modern opinion polls, the internet-based ones, so I suppose it's the reason is being risk averse. That as you get older, you perhaps get more risk averse. The fact that you're probably less at risk from independence in the elderly state, but people worry about their pensions in particular, and that's a question that the SNP really hasn't properly addressed for the elderly population. Wartime nostalgia, I don't think really that should be an issue now, because you've got to be pretty damn old to be, remember the war. And so it's British Empire, what you're taught at school, maybe. But I think the main issue is aversion to risk. And the key thing, one of the things that bothers me about the whole independence movement post-referendum has been that the SNP tell you, they say, go out and make the case for independence. Actually, most people know what the case for Scottish independence is. It's basically the case that the people who live here are the people that are best placed to run Scotland. And there are some people who will never agree with that because they are entrenched unionists or British nationalists or traditionalists. And then most of the rest are either agnostic about it, they're perhaps, or in fact, majorly in favour of it. These people in the middle, we lost the referendum for two reasons. One, fear of the economic onslaught that was going to occur. The fact that we didn't know about what was going to happen to our pensions, what was going to happen to our currency, even though we said that we're going to use the same currency. These issues, the economy, trade with the rest of the UK was something, that all the Tesco lorries were going to turn around at Gretna and this sort of thing. So there was the fear, the economic, largely economic fear. And then, of course, there was the nice little sort of easy option that was produced by the Daily Record and Gordon Brown, which was actually you don't really need to vote for independence because we're going to give you quasi-federalism, and we'll give you it so quickly that it'll be done far quicker than independence. And I think the issue there is that people at the moment, the elderly in particular, I think they want to know not just why we believe in independence. They want to know how it's going to be achieved. And that is fundamental. And telling people, oh, we're just going to ask for a referendum from Boris Johnson doesn't work, does it, really? And so we've got to tell them how. And I think we've also got to tell them what sort of country we could be in terms of improving all manner of things, from land ownership, rural housing, ports, connectivity to Europe, and so on and so forth, and a better welfare system, etc. And as a part of that, we've got to answer their questions. So I think the best way to tackle the no voters amongst the elderly is actually to explain how it's going to occur, and also answer their specific questions on these key issues of the borders, of pensions, and and I don't think that's impossible to do.
Well, that's interesting. Gail McTeer is asking a reasonable question, particularly when it comes to older voters. Why should they take a chance on independence after watching the shit show issue that is Brexit? That's a fair point, isn't it?
No, I don't think it's a fair point, really. This is the tale of two unions, isn't it? The European Union and the British Union. And the European Union is a union of individual, largely independent sovereign states which share their sovereignty and which all get a seat at the table. And the British Union, whereby nobody really gets a say apart from England or Westminster. There is no constitution. There are no rules, really. They make the rules up as they go along. As you well know, each government comes and can change basically the constitution by passing an act of parliament. And so we don't have protections within Britain. And so I remember this caller described the shit show of Brexit. Well, it isn't that the problem was not Europe. Europe didn't want us to go, and indeed would have liked Britain to stay. And the problem has been caused by the country that has left. And we hope that when we go for our independence, that we'll be constructive in discussing our dissolution of the Union of United Kingdom, and that we will be reasonable and negotiate, which Britain has refused to do, really, in Brexit. So I don't think the two are comparable at all.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you've been doing something about this, the fact that people don't have perhaps ready access to information, and you've co-written Scotland Independence, which is a pocketbook on independence, how we may get there, what it entails, and answering key questions. Show us what it looks like. Show us what the cover looks like. There we are, folks. Now, this sounds very helpful indeed, Ian. How do people get a copy of this? Where do they go?
Well, I have a big supply of them. We printed initially 50,000. The reason for writing it was quite simply in the lead up to the last year's election. I was concerned about the fact that the case was not properly being made, and it actually goes back a little bit further. It goes back to canvassing in the 2019 election in a new private housing area in Kirkliston, and I had a succession of what we would call correctly new Scots. Some were English, some were Indian, some were European, and they had come to live in Scotland. And when I was canvassing them, they said, "Well, we know nothing about Scotland. We know nothing about the politics of Scotland. We don't know anything. Have you got something that you could give me to read about it? And I didn't, of course, and the SNP didn't have any publication as such. And I thought, putting together something which explained a little bit about very scanty history of Scotland and the independence movement, and then traced through the journey to devolution, and then the reasons why devolution is not enough and why we need independence, and then particularly tackling a number of issues. Actually mentioned cultural aspects. Can Scotland afford independence? What currency? Constitution, subject close to your own heart. Governance, and so on. Immigration, citizenship, our relationship with the world, and our relations within the British Isles. And so we went through these. I left out just, you can't put everything. I'm trying to make it nice and small and neat. But so that was originally thought of for New Scots in some ways, but basically wrote it over a weekend. And then my co-author, John Brown, who's a former civil servant, I showed it to, and he said, "Oh, I'm quite good at taking, badly written prose and tidying it up a bit and making it more readable and more grammatical." And so John and I have done this together, and we got rid of 50,000 first print copies around to various groups. The Highlands and Islands have taken quite a lot, and as has the northeast of Scotland, and we've transported them with the help of the National Yes Network, in particular Lindsay McRae from Edinburgh and Lothians, and we've transported them to various places around the country, and then they've been distributed through the Yes Network to groups. We've printed a second edition, and I think 20,000 of them have gone out already, and there's another 30,000 still at the printers for me to pick up at some stage.
To put it in context, that greatly exceeds 1,000-fold the likely audience of the Nine Show on BBC.
Yeah.
On which they have spent an absolute fortune. And it has abysmal, a truly abysmal output in terms of its connection to the viewers. The viewership is tiny. We've just put, the producer, Kevin, has just put your website link on the screen so people can go there. If they find it difficult to get copies, can they download a copy from the website?
I think at the present time you can't download it from that website, but if you go to the SIF, Scottish Independence Foundation, you can in fact download. I'm very, as you probably worked out beforehand, I'm not tech savvy, despite having worked in intensive care at one time. But I gather you can download individual copies. If people can read it online, and if they want individual copies, if they email admin at independence-in-your-pocket.scot, I'll send them out. And if groups want, I've got a 600 2 boxes awaiting to be collected by DPD to head to the northeast tomorrow, and have a regular supply of trail of orders like that.
Good for you. I mean, these are the sort of things that make all the difference. You talked about the Constitution earlier. Let me tell you an interesting fact. The Electoral College in Libya says that elections there cannot go ahead unless there's a constitution. And Elliot Bulmer reminds me that this is the norm here. Elections go ahead and there is no constitution, and never has been a constitution of the kind that most people in other countries would recognise. I mean, there's a jumble, a collection of deliberations, decisions, half-remembered judgments, which is what the UK constitution, such as it is, consists of. But as you reminded us earlier, the classic definition, and the one that ought to apply, perhaps, is that the British constitution is whatever the government of the day with a working majority says it is. And we've seen a demonstration of that today, where the Prime Minister is saying, I have to wait for somebody to carry out an inquiry to find out if I was in a garden party. Sorry, if I was in a works meeting in my garden. I may have walked out into my garden, I may have been offered a drink, but that doesn't mean anything unless there's a committee examines it and pronounces upon it, and then I will decide if their findings are appropriate. I mean, it's Mauritania writ large. I mean, it's just farcical. But that's what happens if you don't say, these are the rules, and everyone is bound by these rules. If you allow the person who's making the judgments to change the rules every 5 minutes, which brings us on.
Could I just say about the Constitution? One of the things that in one of my on my present organisations, the Scottish Independence Foundation, some years ago, of course, we fund all manner of pro-independence activities around the country. And one of the things we did was gave some money to yourself and a colleague to do a survey, the only opinion poll just about there's been on constitutional matters, which I think showed quite clearly that the people of Scotland want a written constitution. I should also say, when I'm talking about the Scottish Independence Foundation, that of course the book was generously funded or part funded by the Scottish Independence Foundation. Anyway,
that's good. Well, we talked briefly about, you mentioned Devo Max, and it's been in the news recently. As I said in my column on Sunday, it's like a long dead entity that it re-emerges from its tomb every once in a while, and I was pretty damning about it. And what's your take on Devo Max? Do you think there should be a third question, for example, as has been suggested in the next referendum on Devo Max?
No. Basically, I think that if we could change Britain, you could make a case, although I would not personally make the case, for a federal state. But to do that, you've got to have a complete change of attitude in Britain. You've got to have a written constitution, you've got to have a federal government, and you've got to have a set of rules, that the central government observes. Yeah. And we're never going to get that. I cannot see in the foreseeable future, unless there's a total implosion and the royal family dissolves and so on, I cannot see that's ever going to happen. Yeah. And so it really is ludicrous to say, I mean, after all, post-referendum, we were promised that the powers of the Scottish government were going to be, or the Scottish Parliament were going to be entrenched. But we found out very quickly that that couldn't be done. And we found out very quickly that legislative consent motions and such like had no, and the Sewell Convention had no status whatsoever. And so that, I don't think it's possible. And therefore, to put a question about a halfway stay, a halfway house on the ballot paper is completely mischievous because it can't happen in Britain. I think the other thing is that, of course, people say, what is independence in an interdependent world? It is actually the passport to having a seat at the table. if you're not in an independent state, you can't sit in the EU or EFTA, you can't sit at the United Nations, you can't be an independent member of the World Health Organization, and so on. And so it is actually vital to be independent. No, I would be strongly against Devo Max. It's a mirage.
People say, well, it works in Canada, but I'm reminded of the fact that I think there was some legislation passed recently in Quebec, and the federal government could have interfered, not necessarily overruled, but interfered. And they chose not to do so because they said, this is not appropriate. We could legally do it, but morally and ethically, we should not do it. That's not just a question of personalities in the case of Trudeau. I think it's more to do with the fact that there's a respect agenda that actually works. But strictly speaking, it bears out your point completely. The federal government could have, had the personalities been different, taken action. And that's the worrying thing, is that, as you say, if you're not sovereign, you don't get a seat. If you don't get a seat, then A, you can't defend, and B, you can't be progressive. You can't offer a contribution because you have to go through some third party who may decide for whatever reason you shouldn't make a contribution. So we'll be interviewing Chris Hanlon next week, who put that notion about a third question, and I'll be asking him some of the points that you've just raised tonight, if you don't mind, when we speak with him next week. If you were to, let me ask you a different question, first of all. You're no longer a member of the SNP, is that right?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Oh, gosh. I wrote a few letters expressing unhappiness about a number of aspects of the SNP. And there's no single issue. I suppose the most powerful issue is probably the fact that they haven't worked out a plan for delivering independence for Scotland. That post 2014, there wasn't a proper, if you like, post-mortem. There should have been a conference. Instead, the referendum finished, and all they could think about was the next Westminster election, at which they said they weren't going to ask for independence because we'd lost the referendum. And we were literally bullied into campaigning for an extremely successful election in 2015, and there was a lot of people who, on canvassing, said, "Oh gosh, I wish I'd voted yes in the referendum, but I didn't have the courage." But what they should have done at that time was actually taken a deep breath and sat down and examined what happened, and that just didn't happen. And there has been no serious discussion within the party. I mean, after all, they refused to discuss independence and routes to independence at SNP conferences, but there's been no serious introspection and discussion about the whole issue of how we get to independence. And I think that's my major issue, that they can't answer what the currency is going to be. I mean, they refer you to the Growth Commission and so on, but and then they say they want to join the EU. Well, how are you going to join the EU if you're using a currency of a country which is out with the EU? It's nothing is thought out, and that was my major frustration. And I did, but there were other issues as well. I think. The way the NEC has behaved, and so on, and so there were a whole number of issues. I actually wrote a very lengthy letter to the National Secretary I had previously written to the chief executive. I got no reply to either. And you do think to yourself, gosh, I've given literally probably years of time canvassing and leafleting and more money probably than I should have given to the SNP as well. And you think, even an acknowledgement saying, well, thank you for being a member. I hope that you may wish to rejoin in future would have been nice, but, I didn't get either. And so I've got no regrets. And in fact, I'm not taking part in any party political activities. In my enthusiasm, I have to confess, I resigned from the SNP before ALBA was formed. And in enthusiasm, I did sign up to ALBA, but I have not actually participated. I don't feel strongly enough about resigning again. I think I gave £5 or something. But I'm basically neutral in terms of party politics. I just feel that the Yes movement has to come together. I think the various strands of it, the Scottish Independence Convention, which has, I think, in latter times has performed. It's done some good work, but perhaps has been far too low profile, and it's been a hard slog. There's this SIF, Now Scotland, and various other groups, the National Yes Network, and I think that these groups need to speak to each other and try to work together. It would be nice if Believe in Scotland, Business for Scotland, agreed with that, but despite invitations as yet, they have not come on board. But, I think I don't want to form a new organisation, but I think that we need a forum, which is why we've got a thing called the Independence Forum. It's not an organisation, it's just a place where pro-independence people can, or representatives or participants from various groups can get together and exchange thoughts and views. And would steer, I think, clear of party politics at the present time.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. I could put a counter argument to you, which says, whatever your own personal views, the reality is that the opinion polls say that Yes is running slightly ahead if there was a referendum tomorrow. Secondly, it looks like the SNP is going to take all of the Scottish seats if there was a Westminster election. The Tories have already said that they expect to lose a whole bunch of councillors in the May elections. And I guess the SNP could rightly say, well, these are successes. The opposition are on the run. They have nothing to offer apart from, carping, criticism. Just stick with it, and we're going to get over the finishing line. That would be a reasonable position to take, would it not?
Yeah, I ask that question of myself all the time, and I say to and my wife, who's in the next room, tells me I'm mad for doing what I did. It was a sort of precipitate resignation on a Monday morning when she was out looking after the grandson, and I think you can make that point, but I think that in 7 years, the SNP has not advanced the case for independence. Any improvement in support, which is pretty minimal, 45 to 50%, has occurred really, I think, in a sort of organic way of people just sort of coming round to it. And I think the dangers would be that if the independence case put forward by the SNP or not put forward by the SNP was actually faced by the scrutiny of opposition politicians, if there were any good opposition politicians, which there don't seem to be in Scotland, and by the media, I think they would struggle, and possibly support might falter. I don't think at the present time we're ready for a democratic event, whether it be a referendum or a plebiscite election. I don't think we're prepared for it at the present time. And but I take your point. I think the other thing about Scotland and the SNP is that I think in the early part of the SNP government, and I don't think this is a criticism of the SNP per se, I think every government runs out of steam. And you saw it with the Thatcher government, and how long is it now? It's coming up for 15 years that the SNP have been in power. And but there's so many issues in Scotland that need sorted. From energy to rural housing to the fishing, farming, food industries to connectivity to the continent and so on, plus the poverty aspect of things especially in West Central Scotland, well, in large chunks of Scotland, fuel poverty and so on. And so there's so many things, and I don't get the impression at the present time that the SNP is getting to grips with some of these issues. And having said that, I've no doubt I'll vote for them. And nobody will be happier than I if they successfully get a referendum and win the referendum. I'll be cheering like the next SNP supporter.
Let me put 2 points to you. I mean, you make a reasonable point, a series of reasonable points here. 2 points, both historical. One is that Talleyrand, who was Napoleon's foreign minister, says that revolutions they fail from the inside. They don't fail due to external pressures. And secondly, it's not uncommon for separatist or secessionist or independence movements to be splintered, to reflect a whole range of views. In fact, you could argue that what's happening in Scotland is very modest. I mean, there's no right-wing nationalist party in Scotland.
Yeah. I know.
Which is beyond weird. I mean, it's just, so there's something about Scotland that, in its connection with changing its constitution, that is sort of different to almost everywhere else. Now, Philippa gave us a very trenchant and eloquent response to that last week, which was better than most we've had, which when I ask people why there is no right-wing nationalist movement, they say, well, it's because the SNP is such a broad church. But, frankly, that's sophistry. It's not an explanation. But there doesn't seem to be the necessary attraction in Scotland to be right-wing and to be patriotic. That's my sense of it. That you would need there to be momentum of some kind. It may well be the Scottish Tories are going through a process of re-evaluation. They're now talking about they want a separate Scottish party, which is a very odd thing to ask for a party that's unionist to its core. And maybe what they're trying to say is we're conservatives rather than unionists. In other words, they're on a journey, perhaps, from conservative and unionist, which is a fairly recent development in broad terms, though that was union with Ireland. It wasn't anything to do with Scotland, technically, but they've always been wedded to conservative views. And maybe what they're trying to do is to say, well, we're conservative with a large C and unionist with a small U. That's how it sounds to my ears. And if you think that independence is on the horizon, the last thing you want to do is to be excluded. You want to make noises to say, I'm not completely in favour of this idea, but I can see it as merits without actually pinning your colours to the mast. I don't know. It's a sense. I get the sense that things are changing, but not necessarily within the main independence movement, but there's stuff happening outside of that, perhaps caused by the fact that SNP has been in power for so long, coupled with the fact that it looks like it's going to continue in power for the foreseeable future. Yeah. As an opposition, you're obliged to do something. You can't just sit like a bumper along and say, well, that's just the voters, they're nuts.
I think the thing about Scotland that's different is the British voting system. Yeah. And if you have a proportional voting system, which I know we have a sort of proportional voting system in Scotland, but if you're in Catalonia or whatever, you know that if you vote, you're going to get a proportionate share of the vote, and you're perhaps not threatening other pro-independence parties, so that the pro-independence parties, the left and the right, can coexist. In Scotland, the SNP, to make headway, basically had to consolidate, I think, into one party. Yeah. I think actually Alex Salmond probably managed to maintain a broad church rather better than...
we have to leave it there. I'm sorry, because I'm enjoying this conversation immensely, but my producer reminds me that our hour is almost up. Thank you again for joining us. If you could stick around once we're through, it'd be good to have a very quick chat. But let me, if I may, just wrap up here, because again, we've had another great guest. As I said, our time is almost up. Big thank you to Ian, and a big thank you to all of you out there for joining us tonight. I know you've got other things that you need to do and pressures of your time, so we do really appreciate you being with us. As ever, we've got a formidable list of guests lined up for future shows. We've been talking to a number of MPs, Alan Smith, Richard Thompson, Tommy Shepherd. We'll also be talking to a number of authors, and we'll be talking to people about flags. So we've got a whole raft of guests lined up. And next week, will join us to hear from Chris Hanlon, and he'll be talking about Devo Max and why he feels it's such a terrific idea. As always, please look out for Elliot Bulmer's column in the Sunday National this weekend. You'll find it in the 7 Days supplement. We do appreciate you joining us tonight. I need to mention that after we're through, look out for Scotonomics, and I hope I'm not encroaching too much into their time. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. We hear that when Prince Andrew found out today that he needs to appear in a US court to answer charges of underage sex, that he broke into such a sweat, his doctors are completely puzzled. It's also being said that after PMQs today, Johnson looked as if he'd gone 10 rounds. I wager he didn't pay for any of them. To all of you, thanks for joining us. Stay safe. Take care. Oh, by the way, if you haven't supported the crowdfunder, please do so now. Go right there and do it, then come straight back and watch Scotonomics. See you next week. Thank you again. Good night. Stay safe.